In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at an aspect of the personal identification process, again, relating it to the work of forensic professionals. When we're talking about facial reconstruction, this is something that helps law enforcement agencies to move from tentative to presumptive identifications and then eventually to positive identifications. What is important to remember, however, is that you have to bring in more than just one source of information when you are considering the identity of a decedent or a missing individual. Facial reconstruction brings together two disciplines. It brings together the discipline of art and the discipline of anatomy and physiology. When we look at what kind of identification can be achieved through employing facial reconstructions and, of course, the knowledge that's important to that process, we realize that it will often reside in presumptive identification circles, or in that category of the identification process. When we begin to pair facial reconstructions with DNA samples and other resources, photographic evidence, and of course personal materials, artifacts that are associated with a decedent, we move to positive identification. Facial reconstruction, like DNA analysis, is also part of individualization, a term that, in a sense, is assigned to being able to pair an individual with a medical and dental history. Now, traditionally, artists will strive to produce beautiful or inspiring art. Art, as we know from a cultural sense, is part of our expressive culture. However, the goal of a forensic artist is a little bit different. It's to produce a likeness of an individual that might lead to identification. Using the skull as a basic aspect of the sculpting process, forensic artists will then apply various kinds of skull markers, identifiers, and what they know of tendon, ligament, muscle qualities associated with the material surrounding, the soft material surrounding the skull, and then, of course, their understanding of skin, not only the epidermis, the dermis, but also subcutaneous landmarks and materials. To get at all of this, an artist has to understand really three important qualities. First, he or she has to understand something about human growth and development. We're not always dealing with a child, we're not always dealing with an elder or an elderly person. Ultimately, we have to know something about how an individual ages, and it's usually on a species level. They have to understand something about the biological nature of how we vary. So the things that make us phenotypically different, things that we can observe in our biology that marks us as being of a different biological group, or a group or population that has their own unique social history. Ultimately, we are looking for historical, geographical, or behavioral variations within the human story that have resulted in a more diverse expression of human beings. So we have to have a strong understanding of the kind of the basis, the biological basis, or the biological ramifications of an ethnic history or a racial identity. And then finally, we have to understand something about culture itself. How do we as cultural individuals recognize people of our culture and recognize humans? What do we look at when we are understanding personal identity? What aspect of the face, what aspect of the architecture of the face do our eyes focus in on? And this brings into the discussion a pretty important field of study, in this case anthropometrics, how people look at what it means to be human, how they identify what it means to be human, and how they interact with the diversity that exists within human populations today. Well, let's take a closer look now at the human skeletal system, but we'll focus on the skull just because we are focusing on that process of facial reconstruction in this lecture. So there are 22 bones in the human skull. 6 are unpaired and 8 are paired. And then we have 6 ear bones, 3 in each ear or associated with each ear. That gives us a total of 28. But in terms of facial reconstruction and what we look at when we're perceiving the identity of an individual, we really focus on these initial 22 bones and ultimately the shape that they provide us with. As I previously said, when we're talking about sculpting, skeletal material, specifically in this case the human skull itself, this is the base for sculpting. And it's the forensic artist then, given his or her knowledge of soft tissue and hard tissue associated with the human head, he or she will use the various skeletal landmarks and some of the associated soft tissue surrounding the skull to be able to develop an image, a three-dimensional image of what an individual looked like. Now, the part that we see, the part that we initially interact with is the skin. So let's really look a little more closely at that. Understanding something about the profile of the skin, the various layers of the skin and their content, and how they vary generally across groups, populations, and the species itself. This is very important for that sculpting process. So the skin, as you know, is an organ. It consists of tissue structures. These are joined together, and they have specific functions and activities that they are associated with. In terms of the physiology of the skin, and that's really what we are looking at here in relation to its structure, it is involved in the regulation of body temperature. It protects the individual that it covers. It allows us to feel. In a sense, it allows us to receive stimuli. We can synthesize important nutrients with regard to the functionality of most of our major systems. So something like vitamin D, which is very important and relates to sunlight. This is something that the skin will synthesize. And then, of course, the process of excretion is also something that the skin is intimately involved with as part of perspiration and the regulation of body temperature. Now, for the forensic artist, though, the structure is very, very important. The skin consists of two principal parts. There's an outer, thinner portion. This is composed of epithelium. It's called the epidermis. The epidermis is generally what you see and what we consider to be the skin. It's made up of many different layers. And then you have the dermis. This is just below it. This is connective tissue that is thicker, and it, as I said, is beneath the epidermis. Thick skin has a relatively thick epidermis, whereas thin skin has a relatively thin epidermis. The dermis, in a sense, will vary as well by location. And a lot of the skin that we associate with the cranial vault or surrounding the cranial vault, and to a degree, a lot of the skin that we associate with the upper and mid portions of the face will have a fairly evenly distributed epidermis, a fairly thin epidermis, and correspondingly a fairly thin dermis layer as well. Thin relative to other parts of the body. Then below the epidermis, the dermis, we have a subcutaneous layer. Now, this layer consists of a variety of tissue types. What we are most interested in, I mean, it even includes venous blood flow material and, of course, arterial blood flow, arteries, things like that, not to mention in this case, autonomic motor nerves and everything in between. But what we are interested in terms of the subcutaneous layer is the overall thickness or measure or concentration, volumetric concentration of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fatty tissue. It is connective tissue, but it consists primarily of fat cells. Now, when we're looking at the human head, The adipose expression is most greatly measured or witnessed in the mid to lower face, specifically the lower face. And then, of course, it is a big part of the neck as well. However, the adipose tissue is most thinly expressed in the mid to upper portions of the face and then throughout what we would consider to be the kind of neuro or neurological neurocranium of that section of the head. And so when we look at facial reconstructions, there's a pretty standardized overall thickness that incorporates epidermis, dermis, and this subcutaneous material. When we're talking about adults, adult humans, we're talking about, when we combined all three of these areas, a general thickness of between 1.5 and 2.5 millimeters. In terms of breaking down the various sections, generally a forensic artist will combine the epidermis and the dermis. These will fall into that 1.5 to 1.9 millimeter range. And then the subcutaneous fatty materials and some of these other structures make up the rest of that average thickness. Of course, this will vary according to ethnicity and race. It will also vary according to gender, but it will not vary as significantly as what we see going on postcranially in terms of the lower portion of the body, the trunk of the body, and then the appendages as well. So we have a pretty good range of acceptable error when we start to look at least the surface expression of that reconstruction, the skin and what lies just below. That range of error then tightens significantly when we move below the subcutaneous layer into what becomes a very important resource for us to understand, which is the muscle structure of the face and the head. Now, in terms of muscle structure, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that not all muscle, in terms of its muscle fibers, the muscle tissue itself, not all of it appears to be the same way. It varies by color. And then in terms of its functionality, it also will vary. However, when we're talking about a forensic reconstruction, and when we're talking about sculpting the face, we're thinking more broadly about the muscle itself, its overall thickness, its attachment points, and its action. I would say, given this second piece of the puzzle, the action is the least important with regard to those three areas of interest. The origin insertion, which we'll talk about in just a moment, these are more important than the action itself. Action has more to do with its general location. The term muscle tissue refers to all of the contractile tissues of the body. There are different kinds of contractile tissues. In this case, there are skeletal expressions of muscle, there are cardiac, there are smooth. All of these have an important functional form and overall physical makeup. The muscular system, though, refers to the skeletal muscle structure, and that's what we'll be looking at with regard to the face. Now, what are these terms origin, insertion, and then, of course, what is action? Skeletal muscles produce movements. They exert force on tendons, which in turn pull or move bones or structures in the body. These movements are the actions of the muscles themselves, right? Their functionality. When we talk about origin, or when I use the term origin as we're looking at some of the muscles of the face, generally this is a fixed point. It's the anchor of the muscle. It's what it leverages against. So the attachment of a muscle tendon to a stationary bone is what we would consider to be its origin, or the origin of the muscle. The attachment of the other muscle tendon to the movable part of the bone, so the other side of the story, is the insertion. A good analogy is the spring on a door. The part of the spring attached to the door represents the insertion. The door is the moving piece, right? The part attached to the frame, kind of more associated with the structure of the home or the garage. This, in a sense, is the origin. What we look at in terms of the reconstruction has more to do what is referred to as the belly of the muscle, the fleshy portion of the muscle between the tendons of the origin and of the insertion. So we're looking at the belly or the gaster of the muscle. That section of the muscle, its thickness, its overall shape, that lies between the tendons of the origin and the tendons of the insertion. So when we're looking at how an artist then will reconstruct an expression of the human anatomy like the face or the head, we have to take all of this into consideration. But there are key pieces that we can or have the luxury of ignoring. We start out with understanding the base structure, the skeletal system. We'll be looking at that in relation to the skull in just a moment, or the head in just a moment. We then want to understand something about the skin itself. Right? What is this protective organ that surrounds and protects the entire structure itself? And then what lies between those two entities, between the base structure and what we see with the naked eye? This is the muscle structure. And specific to that muscle structure, what are we looking at? We're looking at the belly of the muscle and the muscles associated with the face. Now, we won't look at all the muscles. We will focus primarily on superficial muscles, muscles that are closest to that subcutaneous layer of the skin. It doesn't mean that deep muscles aren't important, but you have to think of them as creating their own foundation to those surface muscles. And generally, the shape and orientation of the surface muscle can be something that you can literally see or palpate or touch and feel with regard to the surface of the face, the surface of the head. Well, let's start then with the basis of the facial structure itself, the structure of the head, in this case, the cranial anatomy or the anatomy of the skull. And we'll focus on those visible elements or those large visible elements that we associate with the architecture of the skull. From there, we will move to look then at some of the major muscles and bring all of this together with regard to how you, as the artist, the forensic artist, would begin the reconstruction process. So, as I said before, there are paired and unpaired bones of the human skull. One of the most important unpaired bones of the human skull is the frontal bone. And of course, in terms of its overall growth and development, it develops into a left and a right half, again, oriented around that anatomical plane of the mid-sagittal region. The frontal bone forms the upper edges of the eye orbits. It also, in a sense, gives us an understanding of the shape and overall physical nature of the forehead. It contains sinus regions, which are very, very important with regard to the size and orientation of the upper respiratory system. But then it also provides us with some important landmarks for muscle attachment. The temporal line is something that will appear both on the right and left expression of the frontal bone, and it will, in a sense, move in a superior and posterior aspect as it navigates from the kind of anterior portion of the skull to the rear of the skull. Of course, it moves the temporal line, which we'll talk about, that moves onto another bone of the skull itself. Another important landmark is the coronal suture. The coronal suture extends kind of across the back portion of the frontal bone, and it separates out the frontal bone from a paired bone, which we'll be talking about next, which are the left and right parietal bones. Well, let's move on to that. As we move from the anterior to the posterior portion of the skull, and you can barely see it on this image, but it is labeled, you have a left and a right parietal bone. Now, they're interesting because in terms of their external surface, that superior temporal line is another important landmark. the attachment point for what is the temporalis muscle, this large fossa or um, physical area with attachments all around it. Sometimes a depression, but in this case, less of a depression and more of a kind of an eminence. This fossa is an area, broad area, where the temporalis muscle is attached, and that attachment is something that is really important to identify and then to consider as you're reconstructing, as it relates to both the frontal bone and then moving out in a posterior portion into those parietal regions. There are a variety of foramen and sutures that are important to identifying and sighting the parietal bone. We looked at this earlier in our lecture series. However, what we are looking at here is generally its overall shape, and it is concave in nature, and it will have a kind of eminence, or it will push out laterally away from the midline of the body. As we move from this first paired bone of the neurocranium, the parietal bone, we then move furthest back to the very end, or the posterior portion of the neurocranium, and we find the occipital bone. And you don't see it in this image, we will see it in the next image. So make sure to pause the lecture and reflect on its location. As I said, it's situated in the posterior and slightly inferior portion of the cranium. It connects by sutures to the two parietals, which I just mentioned, the lamboidal sutures, and then it will also interact with the temporal bones, again the right and left temporal bones on either side of that neurocranium. It's a thick bone. It's a bone that has very important attachment points for back muscles and muscles of the neck. It is more of an anchor for a lot of those muscles, and in a sense, it has a variety of surfaces that become important, but only one of which is important to this reconstruction process. All three of these regions, though, for that occipital bone, do strongly connect to how it ossifies or grows into a bony, flat bone of the skull over time. In terms of what we're interested in looking at the shape of the back of the head, we focus very much as it relates to this occipital bone on these attachment points, these what are referred to as nuchal lines for muscle attachments. The tendons that we will associate with some of the muscles of the neck and the back are found here. And how large those attachment points are, those lines, those ridges across the back of the skull, how large those are will definitely impact the overall shape of the neurocranium of the head and the back of the head. But then it will also tell us something about the overall size, the robusticity of the person that we are looking at. If we move slightly anterior to where we were just at with the occipital bone, we have our left and right temporal bones. These are important for many of the kind of chewing qualities, the speaking qualities associated with the oral cavity. And there are a variety of attachment points associated with even the chin. And if you think about either side of the chin, kind of the rear portion of the jaw, where we find the masseter muscle, this is also an important area as it relates to the overall size and orientation of the temporal bones themselves. The temporal bones also will include the petraeus portion of the skull, which contains the ear bones, and it will also express this external auditory meatus, this hole that exists outside, both in its most lateral expression, outside of the temporal bone, and this is where we have, of course, the ear being attached. And there are a series of reconstructions having to do with the shape of the ear, but we won't be covering that in this lecture. As we move internally, and then as we look laterally to either side of the skull, we also have the sphenoid bone. This is an unpaired bone of the skull, and we only see what are referred to as the wing, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone in terms of the reconstruction process. So if you're considering kind of where this is, if you move just anterior to the temporal bone within that cranial environment, just behind the eye orbits, this is where we find that sphenoid bone being expressed. We see the greater wing of the sphenoid bone just behind the eye orbits. And what I'll be talking about, another paired bone, the zygoma, um, again, just behind the eye orbit, and the zygoma creates part of the eye orbit. But the sphenoid bone is also important with regard to the overall shape of that neurocranium, or the section of the cranium that contains, surrounds, and protects, in this case, the brain. We then wrap back around to the bones of the face. We have the maxilla. The maxilla is a paired bone of, in this case, the jaw. This becomes important to understanding something about the overall shape and unique um, identity that we assign to the dental arcade. It also gives us a sense of protuberance, or the amount of forward projection that exists within the face itself, and that does vary slightly by race and ethnicity. The maxilla has, again, a left and a right expression, and at its inferior border, we have this alveolar process, or the section of the bone that contains the dentition, and it has that nice parabolic shape, or that kind of arch to how the teeth are organized and oriented. Um, just above that, inside the oral cavity, of course, we have the hard palate, to give you a little bit of an orientation to that. Now, when we're talking about the maxilla, this is also an important bone for being able to look at the overall uh, measurements of the nose, its overall breadth, or its width. And that breadth of the nasal cavity will vary by race and ethnicity, and it will be something that we will look at a little more closely when we're reconstructing the nose. Not necessarily the angle of the nose as it moves toward, from the kind of the bridge of the nose to the tip of the nose, but more side to side, the overall width of the nose itself. This bone will then give us a physical expression of the base of the eye orbit, and it will extend up toward the midline of the body and provide us with that median shape to the eye orbit. And of course, even the shape and more breadth of the nasal cavity and the bridge of the nose. We then have, in that same area, kind of closest to the midline of the body, another paired bone, the nasal bone. These are very, very small in nature, and they form the bridge of the nose. And the angle is very important here when you're doing reconstructions. Very often you will run maybe a small wooden rod out from the nasal opening, running it along the inferior portion of the left and right um, nasal bones, running that out to determine where the cartilage, the orientation of the tip of the nose, where that is, and the overall size and orientation of the cartilage that we associate with the nose, that where that is located, and how it extends out, the angle. Another important aspect in terms of the geometry of the nasal bones relates to how they are articulating with the frontal bone. You will notice that this area of articulation, when you look at an individual from the side, will vary as that angle of the nose extends or opens up as it relates to the overall flatness of the face. The angle that exists between the bridge of the nose and the frontal bone will also then diminish pretty significantly, and that will be another important characteristic that your eye will pick up on and associate with the identity of the person. Just to the lateral edge of both the maxilla and the nasal bones, we have the cheekbones. We have the malar bones, the zygomatic bones. They have many different names to them. These are very, very important for being able to get a sense of the width of the face. Their angle and orientation will be things that we can associate with ethnicity and race. If we're to take a look at you from the side, for example, where the anterior surface, the anterior edge of the zygoma is, both the left and the right, in relation to where your chin is and the overall flatness of your face, where those oriented, that will be something that will very much speak to your ethnicity and to a lesser extent to your race. The zygomatic bones, the left and the right, this paired bone of the skull, will also create, in a sense, or give you the architecture of the lateral and slightly inferior edge of the eye orbit. They will articulate, of course, with the temporal bone. We'll be looking at some of the muscles there. And then, of course, with the frontal bone along that lateral edge, the maxilla, of course, then more medially. And then we have the unpaired bone of the mandible, which is the one that I'll kind of end this look at the kind of skeletal structure of the head with, the mandible being, again, unpaired and one of the more important aspects of the skull in this reconstruction process. It will have a left and right developmental side to it, but it does grow into a single thick, large bone of the skull itself. Now, the mandible, its orientation with regard to that ascending ramus, kind of the section that articulates with the temporal bone, the occipital bone, again, the base and the sides of the neurocranium itself. The orientation of that, then the edges of that, the angle that that creates with the body, as it creates almost a 90-degree angle. This is a gonial angle. This angle and what happens to it, both in terms of the angle itself, looking at it in side view, but then also what happens to the edge or the kind of the baseline of the mandible itself as it flares outward or inward. These are things that we can associate with gender and robusticity. These would also be things that we can then assign to the personal identity of the decedent. And here you can see where that angle is and how important the overall body of the mandible as it extends in an anterior fashion toward the chin, how important that is to be able to understand as you're reconstructing the face. Then, of course, the chin itself, a unique quality of human primates in general, but one that we can build on in terms of the overall orientation of that lower face and the dental arcade itself. And feel free to just take a moment, pause the lecture at this point, and just review those major bones of the skull that I decided to highlight due to their structuring of the head and of the face. Think about those same kinds of bones in your own head and the shape of your face, and even palpate some of the areas maybe associated with the midface and the mandible to be able to get a sense of where these bones are and their general orientation. After doing this, after taking a moment just to get a sense of the orientation, make sure to connect the very brief overview that I've given you here with your course texts. They will be introducing to you, both of them in this case, will be introducing you to the overall shape of the skull, the major anatomical planes of the skull. Those are always good to review because the orientation of these bone structures in relation to those anatomical planes are very important with regard to this individualization process. And then take a look at some of their descriptions with regard to the overall size, shape, and location of these cranial and skull bones. All right, now we're going to be looking at the muscle structure itself. As I said before, we're kind of building from the base up. The most important qualities of understanding facial reconstruction begin with skeletal structure, the orientation and size of bones, how they connect to the identification process as it relates to sex, age, race, and ethnicity. But now we're going to look at more species-specific kinds of qualities having to do with origin, insertion, and then the overall shape of the belly of mussels themselves. What I'll be doing here is I'll be highlighting certain mussels and some cartilage and their location. I'll be talking about the origin, insertion, and I will mention the action of these mussels. But what I would like you to do periodically is stop the lecture and look at where these mussels are. We're going to start by looking at it from a frontal view, but then we will move into a lateral view as well. And we'll only highlight superficial mussels, for the most part, that are important to the overall physical structure, the morphology of the head and the face. Let me highlight a few mussels as they relate to facial expression, and I'll start with one that is directly in front of you here in this image, which is the frontalis mussel. This is associated with the forehead. In terms of the origin, the Gallia aponeurotica, the aponeurosis that extends across the top of the neurocranium, that kind of connective tissue material, kind of that white color that you see at the top of the image, that's where it originates, and then it connects to the skin that is associated with the top of the eye orbit, or what is referred to as kind of a supraorbital region or line. This allows us to kind of draw the scalp back, raise our eyebrows, wrinkle our skin, again, and it is associated with the forehead and the forehead's overall shape. Now, how the frontalis muscle lies across the frontal bone is important. Of course, the frontalis muscle is divided into kind of a left and a right expression, and in this image you can see the underlying bone as part of that. The thickness of the frontalis is pretty standard, but it will, in a sense, follow the contours of the frontal bone itself. So basically you're laying on a layer of, in clay of course, muscle tissue to this region, and you are creating that kind of origin along the superior edge, and then you would connect that to the skin material, or just underneath, you would tuck it underneath the skin material, clay of course, that you are associating with the brow ridge and eventually where the eyebrows are located. And so it's going to thicken in that area as well and add to the overall shape of the eye. Just below the insertion for the frontalis then, and it's something that you could actually combine in the clay medium, is the orbicularis oculi. This is associated with the eye orbit itself. So generally what we do in the lab is we will insert some sort of eye structure, usually a wooden dowel-like object, a sphere. We'll place that into the eye orbit. There's a few different sizes that you can use, and then around that we construct the orbicularis oculi. In a sense, it's creating or it fixes itself to the medial side of the eye orbit, so you really want to affix it to the bone there, and then you want to create kind of a circular path around the eye orbit with the remaining portion of the clay material. And we would use about the same thickness for this, overlaying that object that represents the eye itself, overlaying that in a superior and inferior fashion. You would lay that around that, almost like it's the shape of a football, but then it is more affixed in this case to the medial side of the eye orbit and a portion of the nose itself. And it would be my suggestion to lay down the frontalis muscle first, so that you can then bring the orbicularis oculi up and blend it just above, in this case, that insertion for the frontalis muscle. And you can start to create striations here. We have tools in the lab where they allow you to create those kind of muscle fiber-like striations to give you a sense of the direction of the muscles and their orientation. Now, in terms of what this uh, orbicularis oculi muscle does, it closes the eye orbit. So if you wanted to have closed eye orbits, if you wanted to have a closed eye expression, you could do that as well, and that would then allow you to extend that muscle all the way to the edge of the eye opening itself, but in a closed fashion. Now, when you're laying this down, also you would want to create a small indentation around the eye itself. This allows for the different glands associated with the surrounding tissue. It would also allow for the tarsi, the actual um, skin and connective tissue that creates the eyelid itself, both the upper and the lower. So again, this is something where a little bit more artistic license is taken, just because it's a pretty standard design to the muscle structure of the upper face, but it gives that human appearance to what is just skeletal material initially. The zygomaticus major is another important superficial muscle that I think is very important for facial reconstructions and in terms of its orientation. Also, it is another muscle that's associated with facial expression. The zygomaticus major is associated with the zygomatic bone. That's where it originates, and then it will extend to the skin at an angle around the mouth. So it will actually connect the mid face to the lower portion of the face and the orbicularis oris, which surrounds in a very similar fashion to what we saw with the orbicularis oculi. It's a muscle structure, the orbicularis oris, that surrounds the mouth in this case. However, it projects a little bit more outward, just because it's thicker in terms of its belly, and it contains, in this case, or it follows the contour of the maxillary bone in that region. So the shape of that alveolar region in the maxilla, that is going to be very important for the orbicularis oris. So again, the zygomaticus major is going to focus on that zygomatic bone, and then it is going to move down to the region of the mouth. And so you bring it from really the most lateral expression of the zygomatic bone. You have to think about that portion of the zygomatic bone that is extending back toward the temporal bone, and then it is going to reach in a superior fashion up and around the eye orbit. Kind of the angle that those two make and where it extends most laterally, that's where you're going to connect it, and then you'll bring it to the mouth. And at the same time, and this can be something that's not tucked under, but it's something that lays over or connects or is blended directly with the zygomaticus major. You have the orbicularis oris, and it's a muscle fiber that surrounds the mouth. And that's really where it originates. It literally just kind of connects all around the mouth, and then it inserts with the skin at the corner of the mouth. And this allows you to close your lips. It allows you to compress your lips. In a sense, it's very important for the shape of the lips, and ultimately it's important for the process of speaking. Now, here's where if you have maybe a photograph of the individual, you can work off of that to create the proper thickness for the orbicularis oris, and kind of even add some clay material underneath and around the lips. It may help you to also develop the lips. If you know something about the ethnicity of the individual based off of maybe the skull itself, even their racial affiliation, or if there are any other additional sources of information, that can also help you to control the thickness and expression of the orbicularis oris around the mouth, and then prepare it for the lips. Then moving in an inferior fashion to where we're working off of in and around the mouth. You can then think about the chin. The chin is another one of these really important areas for identification, at least in terms of its structure and shape. The depressor labii inferioris is associated with the anterior portion of the mandible. It follows either side of that midline. So the mandible becomes a connection there, specifically in and around the chin, and then that will move in a superior portion rather, up to the lower lip and the skin just at the edge of the lower lip. This lowers the lips, depresses them in a sense, and again is more associated with patterns of speech. If we then turn to a lateral view of the muscle structure, again associated with the skull, there are a few superficial muscles, large muscles, that are important to understanding a species-related expression of our face. It's also something that, in a sense, is unique to the human primate. As I mentioned before, we have that large temporalis muscle, again associated with that fossa that extends across both the frontal and parietal bones. It then will cover and connect with the temporal bone, so it is going to be on both the left and right side. You can see the striations regarding the temporalis muscle and how they are moving down and behind that zygomatic arch made up of both the temporal process of the zygoma and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The origin for this is considered to be the parietal bone, but again, that origin extends to the frontal bone. The insertion would be the top of the rising ramus of the mandible, so the top portion of the mandible, specifically not where we have the mandibular joint, but just anterior to that, that coronoid process of the mandible. So it tucks in behind. And that will start to connect the midface and the lateral portions of the midface to the shape of the head. You also have the masseter muscle. This is really important. It is a thick bellied muscle. It will connect with the maxilla and the zygoma, specifically the arch there, the kind of thick edge, bottom edge, tubercle of the zygomatic bone. This is something that is unique to the shape and orientation of the zygomatic bone, so it is something that's very much controlled by ethnicity and race. So we have the origin there, and then it inserts along that angle I was describing, the angular edge and part of the ascending ramus, and I would say the body of the mandible itself. Once you put the masseter muscle on, you're going to start to really see the shape of the face take shape. Now the masseter muscle will be much larger in terms of the belly, that portion, as it gets closer to the mandible in a male than a female. You will also want to take a look at the overall shape of the body to ramus kind of interaction and angle, and that flare, that at that gonial angle, that flare that may or may not be there in the shape of it, and its overall size, to be able to control the size, the overall width or breadth of that masseter muscle there as well. So temporalis and masseter are very, very important. And then we have the buccinator muscle that tucks behind the masseter. So probably before you're adding the masseter in terms of the media that you're working with, the clay material, you would probably tuck that buccinator muscle behind that. And the buccinator muscle is an interesting one just because, again, it is associated with the cheek. It compresses the cheek if you're blowing air, or it can, in a sense, if you're sucking on a straw, it can be engaged at that time to kind of close in that oral cavity to create that stronger suction. The origin for the buccinator, buck means cheek, is going to be the alveolar process of the maxilla and the mandible. And then it is going to insert with the orbicularis oris. So it's going to come across almost in a lateral fashion, or a running parallel almost to the bottom angle of the mandible, and then it will tuck in just underneath that orbicularis oris muscle. And so that's going to be another important muscle to start building up and building out that lower face. And remember that with the zygomaticus major and minor, I mentioned the major, and then also what's going on with the masseter and the buccinator muscle, these are going to be also affected by fats that will develop underneath them. So if you're dealing with a person that's a little heavier set, you'll have to fill that out a little bit. If you are, in a sense, working off of an old photograph, or if there is evidence of connective tissue and material that was recovered from the remains or the condition of the remains, take that into consideration when you're laying in some of these, or even before you're laying in some of these muscles. You can place some clay underneath them before you lay the strips down as well. The nasalis muscle is one that I hadn't mentioned. You can see that in the previous slide, that there will be a left and a right, and that will attach in and around the bridge of the nose. And then, of course, we have the nasal cartilage, which will follow in terms of its angle and its breadth. It will follow the overall shape of not only the nasal opening itself, but then also the angle of the nasal bridge made up of those two nasal bones. So take all of this in. There's a lot of material to consider. There's a lot of additional muscle structure that we would want to associate with the facial reconstruction before we lay on that kind of average layer of epidermis and dermis material. But it is going to start allowing you to see beyond the structure of the skull, beyond that kind of base, as you're adding the clay to it. And you're adding it in a way that accounts for, takes into consideration the anatomy and the overall physiology. The physiology being more with the muscle structure here, but the anatomy being more focused on the overall shape and size of features of the skull itself.